Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Moviesnips. Today I'm going to be discussing the history and planetary characteristics of Arrakis, which is the most important planet in the Dune saga because it's the only planet in the known universe where the spice melange can be found. So let's get into this. So let's begin by discussing the astronomical, geological, environment, and environmental characteristics of Arrakis. So Arrakis, also known as Dune and later Arrakis, after the death of God Emperor Leto II, was a harsh, arid desert planet located on the far edge of the old Imperium in the Canopus star system. It was the third planet orbiting its star. It started out as a distant backwater world, which was only valuable because it was the only planet on which spice melange could be found, at least until later on in the Dune saga. So the spice was vitally important to sustaining interstellar space travel and commerce across the far reaches of the Imperium. Arrakis would later become the Imperium's capital world under Paul Muad'Dib's new empire. So Arrakis was orbited by two moons. The first and larger of these bore a formation which looked like a human fist, and the second smaller moon had a formation that resembled a kangaroo mouse. So it had a mean surface temperature of about 75 degrees Celsius during the day, but probably had a mean ambient temperature of about 45 to 50 degrees Celsius at shoulder height. Sub-freezing temperatures only occurred at the poles. Nights were generally and relatively cool. So climatic conditions around the mid-latitudes of Arrakis somewhat parallel the climatic conditions of Earth's harshest deserts, like the Sahara Desert, to give you one example. So because of Arrakis's unusual elliptical orbit, the length of a single year on the planet varies from 295 to 595 standard days over large expanses of time. So it is an irregular year length, and because of Arrakis's rotational relationship between its two moons and two of the other planets in its star system, an average day on Arrakis is about 22 standard hours long, but can be as short as 4 standard hours long and as long as 51 standard hours long. Again, this is because of the strange relationship that it has in relation to the planets that surround it, as well as its moons and its elliptical rotational pattern. So major settlements and centers of commerce on Arrakis were located near the northern polar region of the planet, namely Arrakeen and Carthage, the two largest cities on the planet. So the regions further out into the deep desert near the middle latitudes of the planet were largely uninhabited, save for a number of native Fremen siege communities. The largest sandworms, exceeding 450 meters in length, were also believed to roam the sands of the deep desert. So Arrakis is not a very large planet, having a diameter of only about 3,500 kilometers, or it's only about the size of Earth's moon, so not a very large planet. So notable and unforgiving weather phenomenon that existed on Arrakis was its incredibly severe sandstorms, which could reach speeds of up to about 700 kilometers per hour or 435 miles per hour, which could literally tear the flesh off a man's bones while he was still standing. They were that strong. The cause of these super high-speed winds wasn't fully understood, but it was believed that on desert worlds such as Arrakis, superstorms were a result of the excess ozone buildup in the planet's atmosphere. This increased pressure caused by temperature differences between the different layers of the planet's atmosphere would cause convection and advection effects that would in turn brew tremendously strong and violent storms. So mountains were isolated, with a few of them being volcanic peaks such as Mount Idaho, Mount Kynes, and Observatory Mountain. Several ranges had peaks exceeding 7,400 meters in elevation. Mount Idaho was its highest peak. Its summit was 9,524 meters above the bled, compared to only 7,393 meters 7,000 years earlier. So due to the unique planetary conditions that existed on Arrakis, erosion and other geological changes occur at a much faster rate than on other planets such as Earth. Although Arrakis has no natural bodies of water and it's a desert planet in the truest sense, water can be extracted from a variety of sources. Water can be extracted from the ice caps in the polar regions of the planet, and vast reserves of water were located deep within the mountains of the planet, as well as within the bodies of countless sand trout. The sand trout were the baby sandworms. So small amounts of water vapor also existed in the atmosphere and were harvested via wind traps. So the atmosphere consisted of nitrogen and oxygen in proportions that allowed human beings to live on the planet without respiratory equipment. So the production method of atmospheric oxygen sufficient to sustain limited biological life is through sandworm metabolism, which acts kind of as like an oxygen producing factory. So for this reason, the sandworms were incredibly important, not only for their role in the production of spice melange, but also in maintaining the planet's oxygen supply. So animals and plant life, although sparse, did exist on Arrakis. Sandworms were, of course, the largest creatures to roam the sands of the desert planet. Other animals native to Arrakis included the kangaroo mouse, also known as muad'Dib, and the kit fox, desert hare, desert hawk, dwarf owl, desert bat, as well as various types of insects, scorpions, and spiders. So plant life included poverty grass, low lupines, dwarf tamarisk, saguaro, and various shrubs and bushes. Plant life was largely adapted to the conditions of an arid environment. And during the times of the Old Empire, during the events that predated the original Dune novel, Imperial scientists had various laboratories scattered across Arrakis to estimate its worth. With the rise of the thinking machines, all the scientists left Arrakis out of a fear that interstellar travel might break down in the upcoming turmoil. So later, the Zen-Sunni wanderers settled on Arrakis, maybe as part of their exodus to flee the thinking machines and the robotic armies. So their ship crash landed on Arrakis, and they were forced to remain stranded on the desert planet and adapt to its harsh environment. They mainly made a living by scavenging the desert for anything that could be sold to merchants at the spaceport. The sandworms were considered demons during these early years, and the Zen-Sunni wanderers were actually the ancestors of the Fremen. So the distinction of the Fremen began with Salim. His naib exiled him from the siege, believing that this was for the good of the tribe. But Salim was innocent, so he never forgave his naib and saw no need to return to a normal life. So he was the first to learn how to ride a sandworm and became the first worm rider of Dune. And he gathered followers who despised the extravagant, sinful life of their fellows as well. So Salim laid the foundation for a cult in which the worms were considered divine and were revered as such. So decades later, Salim's group mixed with Zenshite slaves who had escaped from another planet called Poritrin, led by Ishmael. So Ishmael declared themselves the Fremen. So years later, the Fremen again split into two factions. One would continue to live on in the desert as nomads, and the other faction would rejoin the rest of the population in the cities to enjoy a better life. So the term Fremen began to be used to describe Arrakis' desert population that lived in sieges. So the fight for survival on this harsh desert planet molded the Fremen's cultural identity. The brutal environment of Arrakis demanded the frugal use of energy and resources, particularly water. And additionally, their history as being persecuted as a people mandated the need for extensive combat training. In turn, this caused the Fremen to emerge as efficient, deadly, and hardened warriors who used their skills and the environment of Arrakis to drive off invaders who often possessed far superior technology and formal training than themselves. So the Fremen typically lived in patriarchal collectives known as sieges, which were led by a naib or tribal chieftain. And so each siege is housed within one of the numerous rocky formations that dot the sands of Arrakis. And collectively, all Fremen belong to the Ikhwan Bedouin, or the broad brotherhood of Fremen. So other human settlers included the Graben population in the urbanized villages and towns of Arrakis. So this population consisted of townspeople and off-worlders who tried to make their living through the water or spice trade. So the promise of riches through the sale of water to the Fremen and the sale of spice melange to other worlds brought many people to the more populous centers of the planet. So Arrakis also eventually came under stewardship of the great houses of the Landsred, notably House Harkonnen and then later House Atreides. As a Cyrodiil fief of the Imperium, whichever house or great house had possession of this fief would typically maintain a large population that included a military force, administrative staff, family members, household staff, a spy network, and a spice mining industrial complex in service of the Emperor. So before the discovery of the spice melange on the planet, Arrakis was of little tactical, biological, or geological interest to the inhabitants of the Corino Empire. But however, the powerful effects of the spice, especially with regard to space travel, quickly made it an essential resource and a vital focal point for the Empire. The spice was a necessity as it helped the guild navigators traverse through full space. The discovery of spice melange noticeably increased the planet Arrakis' significance, and by the time that House Atreides assumed stewardship of the planet, spice had become a critical component of the Corino Empire. So later on, Corino plot to develop a spice alternative or synthesize it, essentially manufacture a synthetic form of spice, prompted Emperor Elrond IX and his son Shaddam to take a keen interest in the geology and biology of the planet. So previous experiments had seen sandworms die shortly after they were transplanted from Arrakis to another world, but regardless of how faithful a reproduction of their ecosystem was made, the sandworms just would not survive no matter what on other planets. They were uniquely adapted to live on to survive and produce spice on Arrakis and nowhere else, on no other planet. So as a result, Elrond sent his imperial planetologist Pardak Kynes to analyze the planet's ecosystem. So Kynes' analysis of Arrakis convinced him that the planet was once a lush, green, and fertile world. He believed that through careful and multi-generational planning, Arrakis could once again become a paradise. So the Fremen, enchanted by Kynes' stories of large bodies of water, greenery, and mild temperatures, not requiring still suits, not requiring still suits, followed him zealously. So Kynes became somewhat of kind of like a martyr to the, not a martyr, but a very charismatic and inspiring figure to the Fremen. And Kynes became so fascinated by the planet and its people that he married a Fremen woman, eventually being absorbed by their culture and coming to be known as a leader among the Fremen. He saw so much potential in the planet and its people that he sought to hide its secrets from the Emperor. So this eventually led to Kynes' death, but not before leaving a legacy with the Fremen, passing his knowledge and wisdom down to his son, Liet Kynes, and a long-lasting vision for the Fremen people. So during Emperor Shaddam's rule in 10,191 AG, House Atreides arrived on Arrakis and took control of the planet and spice production. So by this time, the planet had for some years been under the iron-handed control of the Atreides' sworn enemies, House Harkonnen, who managed spice mining operations on behalf of Emperor Shaddam. So shortly after arriving on Arrakis, the Atreides were betrayed by the Harkonnen and Imperial forces, who led a joint attack against them and ousted them from power. But as the events of the original Dune novel would unfold, Paul and Lady Jessica would go into hiding, and after seeking refuge with the Fremen, they quickly became their leaders through their inherent ability to command loyalty, their knowledge of Bene Gesserit battle tactics, and through their promise that Kynes' vision would eventually be realized under the Atreides rule. So 3 years later, Paul Atreides, under the Fremen name of Muad'Dib, using the Atreides family atomic weapons, blew a hole in the shield wall that had been protecting Arrakeen since the dawn of time. And riding into the city on sandworms, the Fremen defeated the Harkonnen and Corino forces, and Paul Atreides declared victory and ascended to the Golden Lion throne. And Arrakis became the new seat of power for both the Empire and the religious jihad that Paul unleashed upon the known universe. Eventually, Paul's limited interpretation of the Golden Path strategy led to the terraforming of the planet, carried out by Paul's son Leto II, the so-called God Emperor of Dune. Over several thousand years, Arrakis was transformed into a green and lush world, much more habitable to humans, just as Kynes had hoped. Ultimately, however, the new ecology was dangerous to the giant sandworms, and they all but became extinct under Leto II's rule. So during this time, new mountain ranges, rivers, and forests came into existence. So off-world animals were introduced and began to thrive on the planet. Only Leto's Sarir remained evidence that Arrakis was once a desert planet. The Sarir was the last patch of desert left on the planet after the terraforming process. So after some 3,500 years of rule, Leto II was assassinated while crossing the Idaho River after the Guardian Wall of the Sarir dislodged, and Leto fell into the river, and his warm body was destroyed by the water, which was toxic to him, and his body decomposed into sand trout that absorbed water, eventually leading to a recreation of the conditions required for the sandworms to reappear. So what would happen was that eventually, over the next 1,500 years, Arrakis would gradually return to its previous desert-like state. Essentially, the terraforming process that had transformed the planet into a green world began to work in reverse. And also during this time, many names for places had become shortened. Like Arrakis would eventually become known as Rakis, while the city of Arrakeen became known simply as Keen. And following Leto's death, control of the planet was taken over by Leto's fish speakers, the Rakian priesthood, and the Bene Gesserit. So in much later events of the Dune saga, when most of the humanity had gone on to explore the unknown reaches of space in a period called the Scattering, the returning honored matres 1,500 years later caused the most fear about Arrakis. So the honored matres were a group of females that emerged somewhere from uncharted space and were direct rivals to the Bene Gesserit. So the humans of the Scattering had been weaned of any need for melange, and the honored matres essentially saw eliminating spice as a way to break the power brokers, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and the Tleilaxu who had strayed behind in the Empire. So in an attempt to destroy the center of spice production, the planet was eventually attacked and decimated by the honored matres with their space-borne incinerating weapon, which they used on the surface of Arrakis, an action that totally destroyed all biological life and rendered parts of the planet's surface akin to fused glass. So however, their efforts did not totally succeed, and the Bene Gesserit managed to escape with the goal of Dunkel, Idaho. Shiana, an Atreides descendant, their leader Darwi Odrade, and a single sandworm to a planet known as Chapter House. So the sandworm managed to survive the transplant and revived hopes in the Bene Gesserit to recreate the planetary conditions of Arrakis on other planets through the known universe. They believed that, since the sandworm was able to thrive successfully on Chapter House, that all was not lost, and Arrakis wasn't the destruction of Arrakis wasn't the final nail in the coffin for interstellar travel. Upon arriving at the secret Bene Gesserit capital world of Chapter House, Odrade had the worm drowned and some of its sand trout placed into the soil of Chapter House. So gradually over time, the world was slowly terraformed into a planet similar to Dune with a new sandworm spice cycle. So a few decades later, a Gola of Tleilaxu master Twilith Waf was awakened by the honored matres and a Tleilaxu scribe on a planet called Bandalang. So as such, Waf believed it was his duty to reintroduce sandworms to the planet, in which he believed the essence of the God Emperor, who was the Tleilaxu prophet, resided. So having been rescued from the destruction of Bandalang by the guild, Waf was basically he was I guess inspired to take the captured sandworms that he had, and what he did with them was that he reinforced their their mouth sections with armor in hopes that they could burrow through the sections of Arrakis's fused glass surface. So WAF and his specimens were dropped off onto the surface of Arrakis with a small entourage of assistants. So to WAF's disappointment, he released his armor-enhanced sandworms, but they soon died. And WAF was overjoyed later, however, as deep rumblings hundreds of feet below the surface of Arrakis revealed that some of the native sandworms that had survived the attacks decades earlier were still alive. And as the worms breached the surface, WAF, exuberant at the survival of the worms from the attack that had destroyed almost all life on Arrakis, he decided to commit religious suicide and allowed the worms to devour him. So later, the events of the Kralizik, the far future events of the Dune saga, and the revelation of Duncan Idaho as the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach, the Gola clones of Paul Atreides and Chani, newly married, resettled on Arrakis. So by that time, the planet had developed a new spice cycle, producing melange, as the sandworms had managed to thrive and multiply. So that's that pretty much covers all the Dune novels in respect to the entire history of Arrakis from start to finish. From the prequel novels all the way up to the sequel novels, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, Chapter House Dune. So that's the history of Arrakis in a nutshell. And I'd like to thank you for watching and listening to my video today. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel, and be sure to check out my channel for more videos on Dune.